This is Vault of the Void, a roguelite deck builder that is doing things a lot differently from the standard. A lot of you probably are aware of several roguelite deck builders, including, of course, Slay the Spire, which sort of popularized the whole idea. But I've been looking out for games that do that, but in a lot of different ways, and I've got some other videos coming soon on other games, but this is one that I've seen almost nothing on. Like, I haven't really seen anyone else covering this, which is kind of unfortunate because it's really fun, and it's got a lot of unique ideas, and just about everything that it has, every mechanic that it does is a bit different from the standard for the genre, so let's get into it. First off, it's almost incorrect really to call it a deck builder because it's more like a deck rebuilder, you could say, because unlike pretty much every other example of the genre, you actually start with a complete deck, and the deck size is limited to the point where it's actually very specifically limited. It has a ceiling and a floor that is the same number. It has to be the exact same size. 20 cards is the size for your deck, no more, no less. It always has to be exactly 20. And unlike the traditional deck builder fare where you start with a basic set of cards and then as you go through the game you get more and more cards and try and sort of get rid of undesirable ones and put new, more powerful ones in until you sort of come up with some sort of build. In Vault of the Void, you start with a complete 20-card deck already, and instead of building it, you are rebuilding it. You are changing out some cards for others, and in most deck builders, the idea of removing cards is a valuable thing. It's something that usually can only be done a certain number of times, and it's usually something that costs resources, because taking out undesirable cards is a big deal, since in a deck builder, the whole idea of the building part is that you have a pretty efficient deck that is mostly full of cards that you want, with none that you don't. So the idea of removing those is important. In this case, though, it's actually free, because you can alter your deck at any time outside of combat. Because unlike how it traditionally works, you can get as many cards as you want, and they're sort of kept in a separate library apart from your deck, and then you can just choose which of these you want to put in and then take out some of the cards anytime before a battle so that you have a completely flexible deck at all times that you can just change out in order to suit each individual battle before you do it, which is pretty neat. And again, not like the traditional deck builder fare where the deck you have is very permanent and any changes made to it are also quite permanent and very costly. So adding and taking out cards is a sort of run-long endeavor. In this case, no, you can just switch it out whenever you want, as many times as you want for free, which is really neat. This is the reason that pretty much every enemy encounter has a little bit of a summary before you fight them to tell you what in general they're going to do, so that if you want to, you can go to your management page and swap out the cards in your deck for something else that you feel would better respond to the situation. So you're encouraged to remain as flexible as possible, and unlike in a traditional deck builder where you don't necessarily want to always be getting cards since they are added to your deck automatically, in this case you can get as many cards as you want since they're not added to the deck, they're just added to that sort of invisible library, your backpack, and you can then just swap them out whenever you wish. So having more and more cards is actually always a good thing because it allows you to swap them out and have a more flexible sort of arsenal that you can construct a 20-card deck from. Cards also have the pretty traditional upgrade mechanic where you can usually either from a shop or from a tough battle reward or something like that, you can get these upgrade points that you can spend on a card to upgrade it, and pretty much every card can be upgraded. Some of the upgrades are pretty obvious, like they make it do more damage or they make it cost less, and some upgrades add some more fancy stuff like some extra effects that it wouldn't have had before if you use it in a certain way and things like that. So there are lots of different states for the cards. And the other way to change the card states is the Voidstone system. You'll see a gauge up at the top of the screen that is colored with a sort of colored gem. These are Voidstones, and every card has a Voidstone slot, and you can gain these stones. You start with one. You can also gain them by filling this bar up at the top of the screen by doing damage to enemies. Every time you fill it, you get a random stone, and then you can fill it again, but it gets more and more difficult to fill each time, so throughout the run you'll continue to get more stones this way. You can also sometimes get them as battle rewards or buy them in shops along the way. And every color of Voidstone has a specific use, and when you socket it into a card, it provides that bonus to the card. Anything from causing the card to create a mirrored sort of ghost card so that you can cast it twice, to something that automatically adds block to the card and things like that. So these allow you to very heavily customize your deck and actually come up with an arsenal of cards set for very specific things. And since the upgrades and the Voidstones are separate, you can have an unupgraded card with a Voidstone or a fully upgraded card with a different Voidstone in it, and once you put a stone in a card, it stays there. You can't really replace it or anything like that, except for one character with one specific set of starting capabilities does actually have the ability to unset a Voidstone from a card, giving her a unique bit of extra flexibility. And if we go into the way that battles work, you'll see the other differences, and there's a lot of differences in the way the battles work in this game. So So first off, the mana, the energy for casting cards, doesn't exactly work in the standard way. You have a maximum of 5 by default, and you get 3 on your first turn, and then 2 for every turn after that. So you don't always have max energy, and then you can purge a card by holding right click on it, which will discard it and give you 1 energy. So kind of like the Warcraft card game and other games like that involve like discarding cards for energy. This game has that mechanic so that you can purge cards to get extra energy to cast more cards, and some cards even have an extra keyword on them that does something special if you purge them instead of play them. Also very unusual for this genre is the fact that the remaining cards in your hand and the remaining energy that you have unspent when you end a turn both stay. Traditionally in the genre, when you end your turn, you discard the rest of your hand, and then on your next turn your energy resets to whatever the normal mana amount is, and you draw a whole new hand of cards. But in this case, that's not the case at all. You always get that 2 energy from the new turn, in addition to whatever energy you had left last time. It carries over, and you will draw more cards up to the normal maximum, but you keep the ones that you still had. So this allows you to create some more long-term strategies, you could say, because you actually can keep a certain train of energy and a certain amount of cards in your hand between turns instead of having to reset every time, which is really neat actually. And another really interesting difference is the threat stack. You'll see that big red number in the middle of the screen, that's threat. And normally in the genre, when an enemy attacks, it does damage to you. And the idea is when you see that an enemy is about to attack on your turn, you play some block or shield or armor or whatever it's called for that particular game, and that will mitigate that much damage. So if you see an enemy is about to do 6 damage to you, you want to play 6 block worth of cards in order to make sure they don't hurt you. In this case though, you actually don't take damage as soon as the enemy attacks. Instead, all damage dealt to you is put into this threat stack, and it only actually applies to your HP and does damage to you if you end your next turn with some threat left in the stack, which means if you see an enemy is about to attack, playing block then is useless because it'll block nothing. Instead, you have to wait until the threat stack actually builds up. Then on your next turn, you play block to reduce the threat stack to 0 so that by the end of your turn, there's no threat left and you don't take any damage. This is a really neat way to do damage, and it makes the game very, a little bit less reactive, you could say, because instead of just seeing what the enemy is doing and then only having your singular turn to actually deal with it, you have the turn that you can see what they're about to do and then the turn after they do what they did in order to fully respond to it. There was also something called delay block that works closer to how the block of other games like this traditionally works, where you actually play it on the turn before you get attacked, and it will automatically apply at the beginning of your next turn and block the threat or reduce the threat by that amount. So that is the more like preemptive block, whereas the traditional block is more reactive in this case, which is different. It's a very different way to do things. And the enemies have 2 stats that actually change their attack values, and they can increase over time depending on what the enemies are. Different enemies have all sorts of different passives and skills they can use to make themselves more threatening, and enemies have the top left number of their card there, which shows how much each of their normal attacks is worth, and then they have the frenzy stat, that yellow bubble next to it, that determines how many of those attacks they do each time. So if they have 10, that means they do 10 damage, but if it says times 3 frenzy, that means they'll actually do 3 hits of 10 damage, so that would be 30 threat that you have to deal with. And enemies can both increase their actual attack value and their frenzy separately, making the order that you kill enemies actually very important, because another difference is you see that little percentage-based gauge at the top of the screen right below the Voidstone gauge. That fills up as you kill enemies, and the interesting thing about the enemy encounters in this game is, unlike traditionally where it's just the enemies that are in the room when you enter are the things you have to kill to win, in this case every enemy is worth a different amount of that percentage gauge, and once it fills up to 100%, enemies will stop respawning, and then once you clear out whatever's left, you win the match. But before that, enemies will keep respawning. So the way to win isn't just to destroy all the enemies on screen, but to fill this gauge up and then kill the enemies that are left on screen. That's how you win, which means some matches, depending on how the enemies react to each other, if some of them do certain things upon death, or if certain ones do certain things on certain turns to make themselves stronger, or like overwhelm you with extra cards in your deck, or increasing their frenzy a whole bunch or something like that, the order in which you actually kill the enemies can be very important. Since different ones are worth different amounts of that percentage gauge, sometimes there are certain enemies that need to be killed much quicker, than others. And there are even some early combats that are specifically designed to teach you this, that some enemy encounters actually have a much more efficient and effective way of actually taking the enemies down, and these early encounters are meant to teach you that sometimes killing enemies in a very certain order is actually a lot more important than just killing them however you can, because sometimes the ones that are left over might get significantly stronger if you kill them in the wrong order, and the percentage gauge might take longer to fill if you kill them in the wrong order, making the battle last longer. And you actually get a bonus in this game for every combat you actually go through perfectly. If you take no damage at all, if you're always able to reduce your threat stack to 0 before your turn ends, then you will get a bonus of extra essence. Which leads us to the currencies. Essence is basically like gold. It is the more common resource that you gain and can spend on various things like shops along the way. It has a very Slay the Spire-like sort of board that you move along and choose different paths, and this hex-based area to go along and eventually fight through the floors, as you would probably expect for a game like this. It works pretty similarly, although there are a lot of other things you can do, a lot of different kinds of shops and special things you can happen upon, which is pretty neat. That extra variety always helps. There's also quite a lot of variety in the enemy encounters, to be fair. There are a lot of different enemy cards in this game to face. But the other currency is souls, which is interesting because they are much more rare and you don't always get them. The elite enemies drop souls. Sometimes you can also find things like cursed artifacts, which you can take for the price of having some bad cards added to your deck, or you can destroy them for souls. And these souls have a couple of uses. There are the occasional rarer types of merchants that sell things for souls, like there are several artifact merchants that sell all sorts of very powerful passive artifacts. They always cost souls. But the interesting thing about these is they're also used in technically the end of the game. When you get to the third and final floor, you will face the Vault of the Void itself. And before you face it, you have to face 2 of its guardians. Every time you start a game, 4 guardians will be generated. The cool thing about this is each guardian has a bonus, and you choose 2 of the 4 to face based on which bonuses you want, because those bonuses will carry into the vault fight itself. So you're basically choosing what buffs you want to face against the vault once you get there. And then once you reach this vault, you can also choose to consume all of the souls you have left over and haven't spent yet to deal preemptive damage to it. So if you want, you can just not spend any of your souls on artifacts or anything, if you feel comfortable enough doing that, and then once you get to the end, deal a whole bunch of extra damage to the final boss before you actually face it, so you start with less damage to deal to it, which is a neat concept. I'm always a fan of that sort of risk-reward gameplay, giving you lots of different options for your resources, allowing you to give yourself a disadvantage by not spending them, but then get a later advantage by doing a bunch of preemptive damage to a boss and stuff like that. That's really interesting, so I appreciate that being a part of the game. As it stands, there are also 3 character classes to actually begin the game with, each with 2 different starting decks, and the cool thing about these are they're very different. They have vastly different playstyles to each other. One of them being a sort of warrior-y class with lots of very direct attacks that have their own mechanics based on the idea of combo, where you use certain cards to build combo and then certain other cards expend that combo to activate more than one time, which is pretty cool. You've also got this sort of monk-like class, which has this Zen mechanic, where if he plays 3 cards in a row of the same type, then he enters this Zen state, which reduces the cost of all cards by 1, including cards that only cost 1. You can make your entire hand free with that, which is super powerful, and it also sometimes activates extra bits on cards. And he deals a lot with forward planning, having a lot of delay block cards, and this idea of future strike, which is basically damage on the next turn. At every even turn, it deals damage instead of dealing damage as soon as you play the card. He also has this stuff called Shi that he builds up on enemies. And if the amount of Shi an enemy has actually exceeds their maximum health, or their current health rather, then they just die right there, no matter how much health they had left, which is pretty cool. There's also the third class that I'm really bad at that you're seeing right now that's really fun to play, actually. It reminds me of playing like mono black in Magic the Gathering, who is your sort of mage-y style class with a lot of corruption mechanics that involve building this corruption that gives you extra power with certain threshold cards. So the threshold will be how much corruption you need to trigger an extra effect. And she also has this stuff called Soul Tithe, which enhances her corruption abilities, but does threat damage to her at the beginning of the turn. So it's all about managing your risk reward, managing how much Soul Tithe and corruption you want to gain extra power versus making sure you don't harm yourself too much to the point where you take a bunch of damage that you should have avoided. And yeah, this makes all of the classes play vastly different from each other and feel very different. And the fact that each one also has a spell that can be switched out, by the way, you can find and buy extra spells some of which are sort of generic, meant to be for any character, some of which are specific to that character for each run, and the fact that every character also does have 2 starting decks with different spells, sometimes different artifacts and things, means there's actually quite a lot of variety in the game already. I think it's a real shame that I haven't seen much about this game yet, because even though it's in early access, it feels very feature-rich, it feels well-balanced, and it feels quite varied, which is important for a deck builder of this sort, and also the fact that it's doing things, just about everything, differently from the traditional deck builder fare makes it very much worth a look. So I'm going to put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you want to look at it yourself. I would highly recommend it because it already feels, I'm not necessarily finished, but it feels very feature-rich already, and it has a lot of really neat ideas and some fun mechanics, and the characters being so different means you're going to have a lot of good playtime out of it if you enjoy this sort of thing. So thank you guys very much for watching. Check the link in the description to check it out yourself, and I'll see you next time.